It was a crisp autumn morning in Charlotte, North Carolina, the kind of morning that felt like the world had hit pause, where the sunlight was just beginning to peek through the thick, swirling clouds. Darrell Hines, the city's police chief, walked toward the small regional airport with his usual calm demeanor. At 56, Darrell had seen it all: violent crimes, tense negotiations, even moments of personal loss. But nothing had ever prepared him for what was about to unfold on this quiet tarmac. Before we dive back into the story, let me ask you, where have you been? What secrets are you holding on to? Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Stick with us, because tomorrow I've got something you won't believe. It's the kind of twist that'll make you question everything you've heard so far. But be warned, once you hear it, you won't be able to forget it. Today wasn't supposed to be anything out of the ordinary. He was catching a flight to Atlanta, where his son had just moved to start college. It was supposed to be a brief getaway, a break from the pressures of his role as police chief. He had earned it. Charlotte had been relatively calm recently, and Darrell had made it through without any scandals or controversy. But, as life often does, it threw a curveball. Darrell had never been one to stand out in a crowd. He preferred to blend in. His tall, broad frame, his calm, authoritative voice, his dark eyes that never betrayed what was truly on his mind. He had built a reputation for being the steady hand in the midst of chaos, and today that would be tested in ways he could never anticipate. As he approached the small private plane, he noticed something strange. There was a man pacing near the jet. The pilot, who was supposed to be preparing for the flight, was walking back and forth on the tarmac, muttering to himself. It was an unusual sight. Pilots were expected to remain composed, professional, especially before a flight. Darrell thought nothing of it at first, but as he drew closer, the man looked up, locking eyes with him. There was a brief moment of tension, a flicker of something Darrell couldn't quite place. The man, wearing a dark blue pilot's uniform, suddenly stopped in his tracks. His eyes narrowed as he sized Darrell up. "Hey!" the man called out, his voice a mixture of frustration and agitation. "What are you doing here?" Darrell, surprised by the outburst, simply raised an eyebrow. "I'm just here for my flight." The pilot's face twisted into a scowl. "You're not supposed to be back here. You need to go through the terminal, buddy." Darrell frowned, taken aback. "I'm here to board. My flight's right there." He motioned to the small aircraft on the tarmac. The man's anger flared. "I said go back, now!" He took a step forward, jabbing a finger toward the direction Darrell was supposed to go. Now, Darrell's instincts kicked in. As a police officer, especially one who had served as the city's top cop for over a decade, he was used to dealing with all manner of tension. But this wasn't normal. The way the pilot's voice shook with anger, the way his posture stiffened, something was wrong. "I don't think you want to make this mistake," Darrell said, his voice firm and controlled, but with an underlying hint of authority. He stepped closer, showing no fear, no hesitation. He wasn't about to let this man push him around, not today. The pilot looked at him with wide, confused eyes. Then something dark shifted behind those eyes. The man's breathing became rapid, his chest heaving, and just like that, in a burst of frustration, the pilot shoved Darrell backward, sending him stumbling a few feet. Darrell's heart rate spiked, but his body remained still. He didn't react immediately. He was too experienced for that. But as the pilot reached for him again, Darrell's hand moved to his side. His fingers brushed against the handle of the badge tucked under his jacket, the small but powerful symbol of his position. He didn't pull it out yet, but the tension in the air was palpable. "Listen," Darrell said, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge. "I don't know who you think you're talking to, but I'm the police chief here in Charlotte. You just laid hands on me, and that's a problem." For a moment, the pilot stood frozen, staring at Darrell's hand on his badge. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His face drained of color, and his eyes widened in horror. "You're the police chief?" The words came out in a near whisper, almost too incredulous to believe. Darrell didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The truth hung between them like a cloud. The pilot took a step back, his whole body trembling. He wasn't just in trouble, he was in deep trouble. Darrell's reputation had preceded him. Matthews, who had no idea who he was dealing with, had just made one of the worst mistakes of his life. The pilot stumbled backward again, shaking his head. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to get lost on their way out. I didn't mean," Matthews stammered, eyes flicking around as if searching for an escape. "You'll regret this," Darrell said, his voice quiet but cold. The words hung in the air, the calmness of his tone betraying the intensity of the threat. "You don't know who you're messing with." As Matthews took another step back, the tarmac began to feel colder, quieter. Darrell's gaze never wavered, and the pilot's nervousness grew until he finally turned, rushing toward the cockpit of the plane, hoping to escape the mess he had just created. Before he could climb aboard, Darrell spoke again. "I'm the chief of police," he said, his words carrying authority, "and you will regret touching me." Matthews froze mid-step, his hand still on the door handle. A bead of sweat trickled down his face. His heart pounded in his chest. He hadn't just angered a random passenger. He had just physically confronted someone far more dangerous, someone whose every word could destroy his career, his future, his very freedom. The realization hit Matthews like a truck. His knees felt weak. His hands trembled. He didn't know what to do. He'd lost control, and now there was no turning back. Just then, the ground crew arrived, drawn by the commotion. They saw Matthews standing there, visibly shaken, staring at Darrell like he had just witnessed a ghost. "Everything okay?" one of the crew members asked, looking between the two men. Darrell didn't even need to answer. Matthews, completely defeated, lowered his gaze. I need to go." The crew stepped forward, guiding Matthews away from the plane. They looked at Darrell, who stood there quietly, his expression unreadable. The words, "You'll regret this," echoed in his mind. And as he watched Matthews walk away, Darrell knew this was only the beginning. The pilot's rash act had set something in motion, something that would change both of their lives forever. Steve Matthews sat on the edge of his bed, staring blankly at the floor. The past 24 hours had been a blur of panic, regret, and gut-wrenching fear. One moment of rage, one careless mistake, and his entire life had unraveled like a thread pulled too hard from a seam. The airline had wasted no time in responding to the incident. By the time he landed back in Charlotte, his superiors had already summoned him to a private meeting. The HR representative wouldn't meet his eyes. The airline's lawyer had sat across from him, hands folded neatly, delivering the verdict in a voice void of sympathy. You're being placed on immediate leave, pending an internal investigation." The words had barely settled in his mind before the airline's PR team swooped in. Statements were crafted, narratives controlled. The story was contained for now, but it wouldn't stay buried for long. Too many people had witnessed the incident. The passengers who had seen the confrontation, the flight attendants who whispered among themselves. It was only a matter of time before the media got wind of it. Matthews reached for the whiskey bottle on his nightstand, pouring himself a heavy glass. His hands trembled as he lifted it to his lips. He wasn't an alcoholic, not yet, but he could see how a man could fall into the habit, drowning in the numbing embrace of liquor to escape the unbearable weight of his own mistakes. Then came the phone call. His personal phone buzzed on the nightstand. The number was blocked. His pulse quickened. He hesitated before answering. "Hello?" A deep, measured voice responded. "Steve Matthews." A cold chill ran down his spine. "Who is this?" "I know what happened yesterday. I also know what's coming next." Matthews shot up from the bed, suddenly alert. He scanned his dimly lit apartment as if expecting someone to be watching him. "What the hell are you talking about?" The voice on the other end let out a quiet chuckle. "You don't think a story like this disappears, do you? You attacked a police chief, Steve. And not just any police chief. Darrell Hines." The way the voice said the name sent another wave of dread through him. "I didn't know who he was," Matthews muttered, as if that changed anything. The voice ignored his excuse. "Hines isn't just some local cop. He's connected, respected, and worst of all, he never lets things go." Matthews swallowed. He had already played out every worst-case scenario in his head. Legal charges, public disgrace, a career in ashes. But this felt like something different, something deeper. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're running out of time," the voice said simply, "and I can help you." Matthews gripped the phone tighter. "Help me how?" A brief pause. Then the voice spoke again. "Meet me tonight. There's something you need to see." On the other side of town, Darrell Hines leaned back in his chair, watching the news with an expression of quiet calculation. The story hadn't hit the mainstream media yet, but he could feel the storm brewing. His gut told him that Matthews wasn't just another hot-headed fool who made a bad decision. There was something else at play here. The man's reaction, the way he looked at Darrell after realizing who he had just assaulted. It wasn't just panic, it was terror. Darrell had spent too many years in law enforcement to ignore that kind of fear. It wasn't the fear of losing a job or getting bad press. It was the fear of something bigger, something unseen. His phone vibrated on the desk. A text from an unknown number. "Be careful, Chief. This goes deeper than you think." Darrell stared at the message for a long moment, his jaw tightening. He had thought this was just an unfortunate encounter with a reckless man. But something told him this was only the beginning of something far more dangerous, and he wasn't about to wait around to find out what it was. Steve Matthews parked his car in the dimly lit lot of an old abandoned gas station on the outskirts of Charlotte. The air was thick with humidity, the neon glow of a broken sign flickering intermittently, casting eerie shadows over the cracked pavement. His fingers tapped nervously on the steering wheel. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around and leave. But he had no choice. Whoever had called him knew too much. A black sedan pulled into the lot, its headlights cutting through the darkness before flicking off. A figure stepped out, tall and lean, wearing a dark hoodie that obscured his face. He approached Matthew's car with slow, deliberate steps before stopping just short of the driver's side window. "Step out," the man said. Matthews hesitated. He wasn't a fool. Meeting a stranger in an abandoned parking lot after midnight wasn't just reckless. It was borderline suicidal. But something about the man's voice, the same voice from the call, compelled him to comply. He opened the door, stepping into the thick night air. The man regarded him silently for a moment before speaking again. "You don't understand what you stepped into," the man said, his voice a mix of amusement and warning. "This isn't just about a scuffle on the tarmac." Matthews exhaled sharply. "Then what the hell is it about?" The man took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Darrell Hines isn't just a police chief. He's sitting on something, a case, a file, something big, and you just gave him the perfect excuse to dig deeper." Matthews frowned. "I don't know anything about a case." The man smirked. "You will, and when you do, you'll wish you had walked away." Before Matthews could respond, the man reached into his pocket, pulling out a small flash drive. He held it up between two fingers. "Take this," he said. "Watch it, and then decide if you really want to know what's happening." Matthews hesitated, then slowly took the drive from the man's hand. It felt cold against his palm, heavier than it should have been. The man turned to leave, but before he got back into his car, he spoke one last time. "Be careful, Steve. You're not just fighting for your career anymore. You're fighting to stay alive." The car's engine roared to life, tires kicking up dust as it disappeared into the night, leaving Matthews alone in the darkness, clutching the tiny piece of plastic that suddenly felt like a death sentence. It had been 2 days since Darrell Hines had crossed paths with Steve Matthews on that quiet, unsuspecting tarmac. 2 days since Matthews made the mistake of shoving a man he had no idea was the city's police chief. Now, Darrell was sitting in his office, sipping on his coffee, trying to gather his thoughts. The early morning had been quiet, and for once, he welcomed the calm. But deep down, he knew the storm was coming. He could feel it. The phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. Darrell picked it up, his fingers lingering over the receiver. He had just received word that a new development had surfaced in Matthew's case. The pilot had hired a lawyer, and the media, which had been silent for the past few days, was starting to buzz with rumors. The story wasn't over, not by a long shot. "Darrell Hines," he said, his voice as composed as ever. "Chief Hines," came the voice on the other end. It was a familiar one, Detective Carl Wilkins, a longtime colleague. "I've got something you need to hear. Matthews, he's in deeper than we thought." Darrell leaned back in his chair, his eyebrows knitting together. "Deeper? What do you mean?" "He's not acting alone, Chief. I'm getting reports from a few of his old contacts in the airline industry. There's someone behind all of this. Someone who's been pulling the strings, setting up the attacks, even before you two crossed paths." Darrell's pulse quickened. It wasn't just the pilot who was the problem. There was a bigger force at play here. He knew it all along, but now he had the confirmation. "Who?" he asked, his voice now sharp with suspicion. "I don't have a name yet," Carl replied. "But I'm digging into Matthew's past, people he's associated with, people he's pissed off. We'll find out soon enough." Darrell nodded, though Carl couldn't see him. "Keep me posted. I'm going to need all the information you can get." There was a pause on the line. Then Carl's voice dropped to a lower, more serious tone. "Chief, I think you should know. Matthews isn't just some random guy. I've seen his name before. Back when we were investigating the corruption case in the airline industry a few years ago, his name came up. He wasn't directly involved, but he was close." Darrell's mind raced. Matthews had ties to the very industry that was now becoming the center of this storm. He could already sense the web tightening around him, but there was no escaping it now. Whoever was pulling the strings behind Matthews knew exactly how to target Darrell. "I need to get ahead of this," Darrell said, hanging up the phone and standing up. He walked to the window, staring out at the city that had been his life for so long. He had no idea just how deep this rabbit hole went. Hours later, Darrell found himself at a secluded diner on the outskirts of town. The place was quiet, a far cry from the bustling city streets he was used to. He wasn't here for the food. It was the man sitting across from him that mattered. This was someone who knew things, someone who had information Darrell desperately needed. He had arranged the meeting in secret. He couldn't trust anyone in the department at this point. Too many were already caught in the chaos surrounding Matthews. The man sitting across from him was someone from his past, someone who had his own reasons for knowing the inner workings of the city's darker corners. "Mr. Green," Darrell greeted him, his tone neutral, but guarded. Green smiled faintly, taking a slow sip of his coffee before speaking. "Darrell, I see you're still in one piece. I heard about the little incident on the tarmac. I guess you got a hell of a mess on your hands now." "I'm not here to talk about that," Darrell said, cutting him off. "I need information about Matthews. Who's behind him? What's really going on?" Green raised an eyebrow, his expression suddenly becoming more serious. "You don't know yet, do you?" Darrell's stomach tightened. "Know what?" "Matthews isn't the puppet, Darrell. He's the pawn." Green leaned in closer, his voice dropping lower, as if the very air around them had become thick with danger. "You're looking in the wrong direction. You need to stop looking at Matthews and start looking at who's been running him. The man you should be worried about is someone much more powerful than Matthews ever was." Darrell felt a knot form in his chest. This was it. This was the moment everything changed. But he needed to know more. He needed clarity. "Who is it, Green?" Darrell asked, his voice barely a whisper. Green glanced around the diner, ensuring no one was paying attention. Then he leaned in, close enough that Darrell could hear his every word. "The man you're looking for is a player in the airline industry, but not just any player. He's tied to a much larger network of corporate corruption, drug trafficking, and money laundering. Someone with enough influence to ruin lives without leaving a trace." Darrell's jaw tightened. His instincts had been right all along. Matthews was nothing more than a small piece of the puzzle, and this person, this shadow figure, had been pulling the strings all along. "Do you have a name?" Darrell asked, his voice hardening. "Not yet," Green replied, "but I can tell you this. The name you're looking for is in the deepest corners of the airline's financials. Whoever is behind Matthews is connected to some very powerful people. People who have no problem crushing anyone who stands in their way, including you, Darrell." Darrell felt the weight of those words. They were more than just a warning. They were a statement of truth. Whoever this person was, they had a reach that stretched far beyond Matthew's petty grudge. "Get me the information," Darrell said, standing up. "I'll deal with the rest." Green nodded slowly, a calculating look in his eyes. "You'd better be careful, Darrell. This game you're playing, it's not just about your job anymore. You're up against a network that has no qualms about destroying anyone who threatens them, even you." Darrell didn't respond. He had no time for words anymore. He had a fight ahead of him, and the clock was ticking. As Darrell walked out of the diner, the night air felt heavier than it had before. His mind was racing, but he couldn't afford to get caught up in the chaos. He had one mission now: to take down the man behind Matthews, whoever he was. But what he didn't know was that Matthews, too, was about to learn just how deep the rabbit hole went. And by the time he figured it out, it would already be too late. The night felt colder than it should have. Darrell's jacket did little to shield him from the chill as he walked through the dimly lit streets of downtown Charlotte. His mind was spinning, but his focus was razor sharp. Green's words echoed in his ears. "You're playing a game far bigger than Matthews. You're in the crosshairs of something ruthless." It was as if the city itself had conspired against him. The streets seemed quieter, the usual hum of traffic now a muted background noise, and in the stillness, Darrell couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching. He had to move fast. Green had promised to dig deeper, but Darrell couldn't afford to wait. He knew better than to rely on anyone else when it came to matters this serious. It was always a good idea to have your own hands in the dirt. He had learned that the hard way in his years on the force. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, but Darrell remained calm, his years of experience in high-pressure situations kicking in. He needed to think like a detective now, not the police chief, not the public figure, but someone who could unravel the truth from a tangled mess of lies and corruption. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking his thoughts. It was Carl, the detective who had been helping him piece together Matthew's past. Darrell answered immediately. "Carl, talk to me." "Chief?" Carl's voice was urgent, but there was something strange in his tone. "You need to get back to the office. Now I've got something." "What is it?" "You're not going to like this?" Carl paused. "I've got word from one of my contacts in the FBI. Matthews? He wasn't just dealing with local issues. The FBI's been watching him for a while. They've got him under surveillance." Darrell's mind raced, but he didn't let his voice betray the shock he felt. "Under surveillance? What the hell for?" Carl didn't answer right away. "You know those connections I was telling you about? The ones tied to the airline industry? It's worse than we thought. Matthews has been feeding intel to someone much higher up, someone who's tied to a string of unsolved crimes in this city. And the FBI thinks this goes all the way up to Washington." Darrell's pulse quickened, but he kept his tone even. "Washington? You're telling me that Matthews is involved in something that deep?" Carl's voice dropped to a whisper. "It's bigger than we thought, Chief. Much bigger. I'll send you the full details, but I need you to be careful. Whoever Matthews is working with, they've got serious power." Darrell took a deep breath. "I'm already in this, Carl. I don't have the luxury of stepping back now." He hung up, his mind now fully in motion. The connection between Matthews and the FBI didn't sit right with him. It was too clean, too convenient. Someone had orchestrated this. Someone had set Matthews up to be their fall guy. But why? What was the end game? He walked faster, the sound of his boots echoing on the empty street. The air felt heavier with each step. Back at the office, Darrell stepped into the familiar surroundings of his precinct, the sharp scent of coffee mingling with the sterile smell of paperwork and metal. He felt the weight of every officer's gaze on him as he made his way to his office. He didn't have time for pleasantries, he needed answers. Carl was already there, pacing nervously at the door. His face was drawn tight, the tension in his eyes impossible to ignore. "You're going to want to see this," Carl said, handing Darrell a thick folder. Darrell opened it immediately. Inside, he found a series of FBI surveillance photos showing Matthews meeting with various individuals. There were no clear faces in the images, just shadows and blurred figures, except one. A man in a well-tailored suit stood out in each photo. His face was never clearly visible, but Darrell could make out the distinctive gold watch on his wrist and the way he carried himself. He had the air of someone who was used to being in control. Whoever he was someone important. Carl pointed to the image. "That's him. That's the man Matthews has been in contact with. We're still trying to track down his identity, but whoever he is, he's got high-level connections. I've never seen someone with so much influence just slip through the cracks." Darrell's gut twisted. He knew that look. He had seen it in the eyes of men who held all the power and none of the consequences. This wasn't some petty criminal network Matthews had stumbled into. This was something much more dangerous. He flipped through the photos and his eyes stopped on one that made his heart skip a beat. Matthews was talking to the man in the suit again, but this time Darrell could clearly make out a logo on the man's briefcase, an airline company's insignia. "Carl," Darrell's voice was quiet, but the urgency in it was clear. "I need you to run a background check on every major player in the airline industry, every CEO, every board member. We need to find out who this guy is, and fast." Carl nodded, already pulling out his phone. "I'm on it, Chief. But be careful. This isn't just about Matthews anymore. Whoever this guy is, he's got enough power to make this whole thing disappear before we even get a chance to expose it." Darrell didn't respond. He was already lost in thought, piecing together the puzzle. Matthews had been set up, and now Darrell was the target. But it wasn't just Matthews he had to worry about. It was the man in the suit, the shadow behind the curtain, who was pulling all the strings. That night, Darrell couldn't sleep. His mind was consumed with the faces in those photos, the man in the suit, and the elusive connection between Matthews, the airline industry, and the criminal underworld. Everything he had worked for, the steady control, the years of climbing to the top of the police force, had suddenly been shattered by a single, reckless confrontation on a tarmac. And the worst part was, Darrell knew he wasn't the only one who had been left exposed. He grabbed his jacket and headed out into the darkened streets. There was only one place left he could go to get answers, one person who might know something about the hidden operations within the airline industry, but finding her would be dangerous. She had been out of the game for years, and no one knew where she was now. But Darrell didn't have time to waste. If he was going to find out who the man in the suit was, he needed her help. Darrell's car slid through the darkened streets of Charlotte like a shadow, its headlights illuminating empty roads that seemed to stretch on forever. The city felt different tonight, a place where secrets didn't stay buried, and the air was thick with the scent of impending danger. His thoughts were still on the man in the suit, the elusive figure whose presence had been haunting him ever since Carl showed him the FBI's surveillance photos. The clues were starting to fall into place, but the bigger picture was still a mystery. Who was this man, and why was Matthews entangled with someone so powerful? Darrell turned off the main road, navigating through residential streets until he reached an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It was an old, decaying building hidden behind overgrown trees and rusted gates, the kind of place that seemed to breathe with a dark history. He parked his car in the shadow of the warehouse, his breath shallow as he scanned the area. He had to be careful. This wasn't a place for just anyone. It was a former safe house, one he'd used years ago when he was working a case that had nearly cost him his career. The woman he was about to meet, however, wasn't just anyone. Her name was Carla Hughes, and she had once been the go-to person for information about the airline industry's underbelly. Carla was smart, resourceful, and above all, dangerous. She had vanished off the radar years ago after a big federal investigation into the airline industry's corruption. No one had heard from her since. No one but Darrell. He stepped out of his car, locking it behind him, and made his way through the overgrown path to the side entrance of the warehouse. He knocked twice, waited, then knocked again. A few tense moments passed before the door creaked open and a pair of wary eyes appeared in the darkness. "Darrell Hines!" Carla's voice was gravelly, almost like she hadn't spoken to anyone in years. "What the hell are you doing here?" He gave her a grim smile. "I need your help." Carla stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The inside of the warehouse was nothing like it used to be. A former den of information now stripped of all its old equipment. The place where Darrell had spent countless hours hunting down leads in the airline industry. It had all been shut down after the scandal, but Carla had never truly left. She'd just hidden herself away, working in the shadows. "I told you a long time ago, Darrell. I was done with this," she said, walking over to a rickety table cluttered with old files and papers. "The things I know, they're not the kind of things you walk away from. You don't go back into this world without it costing you." "I'm not asking you to go back into it," Darrell said, his voice low. "I'm asking you to help me. Someone's pulling strings behind Matthews, and I need to know who they are. This isn't just about a pilot who made a stupid mistake anymore. This is bigger than that." Carla's eyes narrowed. "You're in over your head, Darrell. You always were. That's why I left." "I don't have a choice anymore. The man Matthews is working with, he's too connected, too powerful. I need to know everything you can dig up." There was a long silence. Carla didn't move, didn't speak. She just stared at Darrell, sizing him up like she was trying to figure out if he was truly desperate enough to dive back into the mess they'd both once been a part of. Finally, she sighed. "All right, I'll help you, but don't expect it to be easy. You've walked back into a world that's been carefully hidden from the public for a reason." The next few hours passed in a blur as Carla pulled out old files, piecing together fragments of information that had been buried for years. There were names, high-ranking officials in the airline industry, federal agents, and businessmen who had ties to criminal networks that extended far beyond anything Darrell could have imagined. "There," Carla said, pointing to a name on a faded document. "That's the one, Thomas Wright." Darrell leaned in closer, studying the name. It meant nothing to him at first, but as he looked at the associated documents, real estate holdings, flight records, and corporate investments, a chilling picture began to emerge. Wright wasn't just another corporate figure. He was someone who had his hands in everything from airline operations to black market dealings, with a network that reached deep into Washington, D.C. "He's the man Matthews has been meeting with," Carla said, her voice laced with disbelief. "Wright has been running a shadow network of illegal operations through his airline company for years. Money laundering, arms deals, even trafficking. This goes far beyond the airline industry." Darrell felt his stomach turn. How the hell did Matthews get involved with him? Carla shrugged. "I don't know, but Matthews isn't the mastermind here. He's a tool, a pawn. Wright's been playing him like a fiddle." "But why target me?" Darrell's voice was low. "What does Wright want with me?" Carla didn't answer immediately. She was scanning through more documents, but Darrell could see the wheels turning in her mind. Finally, she looked up, her eyes hard. "You're a threat, Darrell. You've been clean, too clean. You've been the one man who stood against this kind of corruption, and Wright. Wright doesn't like people who stand in his way. He doesn't leave witnesses." Darrell didn't flinch. He had been in close calls before, but the weight of Carla's words settled over him like a dark cloud. "I don't care what it costs," he said. "I'm going after him." Carla gave him a long, hard look, then nodded slowly. "You'd better, because if you don't, Wright will come after you and everyone you love until there's nothing left." As Darrell left the warehouse, his mind was set. He now had a name, Thomas Wright. But the question remained, how did Wright plan to bring him down? What was his end game? And most importantly, how could Darrell stop a man who had his fingers in every pie, from corporate boardrooms to underground crime syndicates? He didn't have the answers yet, but with Carla's help, he was one step closer. The first thing Darrell noticed when he stepped into his apartment was the silence. His phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket, but something felt off. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and instinct kicked in. Something was wrong. He moved quietly through the dark apartment, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. The quiet was unnatural, too perfect. The usual sounds of his place, the hum of his refrigerator, the distant traffic, were absent. Only the low buzz of his phone remained. His phone vibrated again, this time a message. "Stay away from the case. It's bigger than you. Don't make the same mistake I did." The message was from a number he didn't recognize, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a warning. Darrell's heart pounded. He glanced around the room, scanning every corner. Was someone watching him? Had someone broken in? Then he saw it. On his coffee table, a single, plain envelope, sealed with a wax stamp, a symbol of a plane in flight. It was the same logo as the airline company Wright had ties to. The moment he touched the envelope, a sudden burst of sound shattered the silence. A gunshot. It was a flash of light, the crack of the bullet echoing in the empty room, but the shot didn't hit him. Instead, it hit something else. His couch. The bullet embedded deep into the cushion. Darrell dove behind the wall, heart racing. He was exposed. Whoever was in his apartment was coming for him, but he didn't know who. And more importantly, he didn't know how far they'd go to silence him.